concerning love and marriage, courtship. Last week we began with a lesson that hopefully had some application to everybody, married or unmarried, but it was to emphasize the fact that we can have a good marriage. Is your marriage one that's going to be endured, ended, or enjoyed? And I think that all of us want a marriage that will be enjoyed. And today we're beginning with young people, and we'll go through marriage after today, but today will be applied to young people primarily. Hopefully some of it will rub off on those of us who are older. And for those of you who have children who will be getting married, hopefully this will give you a little ammunition when they come to you when they're 16 and say, I want to get married. Hopefully we can give you some ideas that will help you in guiding them in making that great decision. So today we're talking about marriage requires preparation. I heard about a teacher who was teaching a class of young people, and they were talking about marriage, and he asked them this question: what did Jesus say about marriage? And one boy said, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Well, that's a pretty good application of it, I guess. Jesus was not talking about marriage when he said that, but I think it is true that there's some who don't know what they're doing. And we'd like to try to help young people make that great decision. We'll be suggesting some things that I believe will be helpful to them, and perhaps they won't make the mistake that some make when they don't know what to do. I don't know of any theme that is more needful today than the study of the Christian home. The home is in trouble today. I don't think I need to tell you that, but the home is in great trouble today. And perhaps you remember that the Roman Empire fell for several reasons, and one of them was the breakdown of the home. And if I gave you those things that caused that empire to fall, you'd say, well, that sounds like today. And that would be true. And this is one of the things that caused it to fall. They weren't observing the laws of God regarding marriage, and marriage began to fall apart. So I think it's a great need today. We need to talk about it. We need to try to prepare people for marriage. And I believe that we can help them have a stronger marriage, a better marriage, if we can convince them to make preparation for it. One of the reasons that we're not more successful in building good Christian homes today is the fact that we don't make preparation for it. We just jump into it without really knowing what we're doing, and it doesn't last then. Preparation is vital. Young people today are making more preparation for driver's license and this and that than they're making for marriage. So many times today people jump into it without even really giving it a second thought. I remember a story that I heard some time ago. There was a young man and young lady who were going to get married, and it was a real true story because I was preaching in that congregation. They were going to get married, and they really hadn't made preparation for it. People had come together for the wedding. The music had started. They were waiting for the preacher and the groom to come out from the side. And then the young man who was going to preside at the wedding came out and explained that the wedding was off. The young man had called to the building, and whoever answered the phone was asked to go tell the bride that he was not coming. Now, I was preaching up in Virginia in 2 meetings back to back at that time, so I wasn't there. And I called home and asked Mackie how things were, and she explained that thing to me, and I almost bit a hole in my chewing gum. I had never heard of anything like that. They were all there for the wedding, everything has begun, and the preacher came out and said, the wedding is off. That ought not to be. If they had made as much preparation for the marriage as they had for the wedding itself and for the reception, that would not have happened. He should have known that he was not going to get married and didn't want to, and he should have made that decision before they ever got to that point. And so that's an illustration of the fact that people are not making as much preparation as they ought to make for something that is so vitally important. Now, marriage means turning yourself over to your partner that you're going to marry. You turn over your life, your body, your soul, your future, your happiness. You turn everything over to that person. And so that will take some preparation if you're going to be successful in doing that. We do not in this life make many gifts like that to somebody. You don't give yourself to just anybody and everybody. But this is when you really need to do it. When you get married, you need to turn yourself over to that person that you are marrying. We often think of marriage today as just a civil thing, but we don't think enough about the fact that it is a spiritual thing as well. And we ought to be considerate of God's law as we are about the laws of man in regard to marriage. We don't often give ourselves to someone else in any way, but in marriage we certainly need to do that. And unless we're prepared to take that kind of risk and turn ourselves over to our marriage partner, then it's not going to make a very good marriage, and it'll fall apart. Now, marriage is like a three-legged stool. Have you seen a little stool that has 3 legs on it? Generally, they have 4. If one is broken or weak, whatever, you could maybe still use it. But if it has 3 legs and one of them is missing or broken, then it won't stand up. Marriage is like that. There are 3 legs to marriage: love, God, and preparation. And if either one of those is missing, that marriage is not going to stand. It's not going to work. And so we need to make preparation, make sure that we have everything necessary to make a good marriage, follow God's will in the matter. So there must be love, God, and preparation if it is going to be the kind of marriage that we want it to be. Think of the preparation we make in other fields. If you were going to buy a house, wouldn't you have to make preparation for it? You'd have to have a job. The bank would want you to have a job. They won't loan you the money for 30 years if you don't have a job. Or if you're going to buy a car, you'll have to make some preparation. You'll have to have a job to make the money, because every month you're going to have to make those payments on the house or the car. And so you need to make preparation beforehand if you're going to buy a house or buy a car. In regard to things that are really important, we need to make preparation. But too many times, in regard to the things that are really important, we're not too concerned about the preparation for it. But if it's going to be successful, we need to make preparation. Now, we know that if we buy a house at a certain time, those details in that thing are going to hit us right in the face. Make payments on it. Same with the car. And in marriage, we need to make preparation, because all along the way, we're going to need to take care of some things. There are some responsibilities in marriage that we'll have to deal with. Now, we spend so much time with things that are not really important, very little time with the things that are important. If you were getting a driver's license, would you have to make any preparation for it? You'd have to study that book and know the laws and rules, and you have to go take a test. If you fail that written test, you can't get your license. You have to go back and study some more and take it again. And when you finally take that test and pass it, you're still not through. You have to have a driving test. They take you out and see if you can drive. You see, you have to make preparation if you're going to get a driver's license. What about a marriage license? You have to take a test for that? You have to study anything for it? You just go pay a little money and you get it. And yet, we make so much a big deal of getting a driver's license and preparation for it, and very little preparation for the marriage. We just go down to the office and pay so much money and get it. I heard about one fellow who went to that office to see when his marriage license would expire, but they don't expire. We need to think about the preparation that's needed to get a marriage license as well as a driver's license. Well, it's important, very important, to make preparation for marriage. Now, I'd like to emphasize the fact that it is important. We're going to talk about several areas in which we need to make preparation. Successful marriage never comes accidentally. If you have a good marriage, a good, strong marriage, that didn't just happen accidentally. It happened because you made preparation for it, and because you followed the rules that are necessary to have a good marriage. Now, it would be unthinkable to put a 16 or 17-year-old boy in the pilot seat of a 747 when he's never been trained or taught for it. And yet every day, young people, 16 or 17 years old, are jumping into marriage without any preparation for it. I have known young people who got married at a very young age. Now, I'm not saying that it is wrong. I'm not saying that it can't happen. I know marriages of some folks very young, and they worked all right, but that's not a general rule. Usually, they need to wait until they're older. And so we need to realize that we need a little knowledge and experience before we jump into something that's so important as a marriage. So many times young people want to rush into marriage when they're not prepared for it. Now, I've tried to be careful in performing wedding ceremonies, and I try to make sure the young people who are getting married know what they're doing. I like to have a period of study with them over a period of weeks before they get married. The last one I did was right back here in this sound room. There was a young lady who graduated from college. She was a member at Eastern Meadows, so folks were members there, and she was going to get married. Her husband was in the service and stationed down at Pensacola, and he couldn't come every week for me to study with him, and so I have to wait for him to be able to get away from the base, and he'd come pick her up, and they'd drive up here, and we'd meet right back there in that room for about 6 studies, about an hour and a half at a time, trying to help them prepare for wedding. Now, I would like to think that every young person will have that opportunity to make some preparation for marriage, but so many times they just have a ceremony, you get married without any preparation at all. And so I would like to suggest that we make sure that young people are prepared by providing some opportunity for them to study some things about marriage. We're fortunate to be able to choose who we're going to date. Young people need to have that opportunity, and they have the opportunity to determine who they're going to marry. I mentioned last week that there was a time when parents chose the mate for their children, and they still do it in some places in America, in the world today. But I don't like that. I'd rather choose my own mate for courtship, dating, and marriage. But sometimes young people get married when the mom and daddy make such a choice for them. People who cannot accept each other during that period of time don't need to go ahead and get married. They need to be able to go through a dating period and long enough for them to really know the person they're going to marry. And if that person is not what we want them to be during that dating period, we better not marry them. Now, I know sometimes people go ahead and get married even though they know that person's not what he ought to be or she ought to be. A young lady may say, well, he's not what I like for him to be, but after we get married, he'll change. But you know, the marriage altar doesn't alter people very much. If he's not what he ought to be during that dating period, you better not marry him. Better not marry her. I think it was back when I was a student at Alabama Christian College long years ago, back before the flood sometime. There was a preacher who came to the chapel there and spoke to young people about marriage. And he said there was a young lady about to get married, but she told her mama, I can't marry John. She said, why can't you marry him? She said, because he doesn't believe in hell. She said, well, you go ahead and marry him. Between you and me, we'll show him that there's a hell. And that happens too many times. But you better know that before you ever get married. Now, I've suggested that there are several areas in which we need to make preparation. Let's notice some of them. Number one, physical preparation. A strong, healthy body is going to be necessary for marriage. You're going to have to be able to work, do a lot of things in that regard, and it's good to have a good, healthy body. But sometimes we're not as concerned about our health. Sometimes young people do things during the courtship period before they ever get married that ruins their body. Now, we have no right to present our body to someone in marriage and turn it over to them in marriage if we have not been careful about our health. So we ought not to be drinking or smoking or using drugs, doing anything like that that would ruin our bodies. The body is important in marriage. I was preaching for a congregation here in the state of Alabama, and there was a young man in the congregation who was going to get married, and he wanted me to perform the ceremony, but the girl he was marrying was a member of a denominational group, and she wanted her preacher to have a part in it too. So he and I performed the wedding ceremony for them. I've never done one like that before, and it was not a worship period, so I believe we could do it all right. They got married. Not too long after they married, that boy dove into a swimming pool on the shallow end, head first. He must have forgotten that he was not on the other end where the water is deep, but he hit the bottom of that pool with his head, broke his neck. He was paralyzed then until he dies. Not long after they had married, she divorced him then, because she'd have to take care of him, do everything for him as if he were a baby. He couldn't work and provide for her. He couldn't provide the functions of a marriage, so she divorced him just like that, not long after they married. And that emphasizes to me the fact that the body is very important in marriage. And those who are going to get married need to protect their bodies and not do anything that would harm their bodies. If they do something they ought not to in the moral field or immoral field, and they contract a social disease like AIDS, then they could pass that disease on to their mate. David mentioned a preacher not long ago on Wednesday night, a preacher who became involved in immorality and carried that disease home and gave it to his wife. Tragic thing. I knew that man. He and I worked together in a soul-saving workshop down in Pensacola. Came to know each other. He was a man of tremendous talent. Tremendous. He was the preacher for a congregation where there was a preacher school. He was sort of heading it. And as I remember, he was also the editor of the Christian Teacher magazine. Tremendous talent. But because he let his moral fiber crumble, he became involved in immorality. His home was broken up. That type of thing can happen if we're not careful. We need to prepare physically for marriage and keep our bodies strong and healthy, and not involve ourselves in anything that would cause our bodies to become weaker. Now, the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 20, "Brethren, be not children in understanding, but in malice be not children, but in understanding be men. Be strong and healthy." Physically and mentally, physically, we need to keep ourselves strong and healthy for marriage. Sociologists tell us that the best time for women to marry is about age 20 or 21, and for men about 21 and 22. I guess that means women grow a little faster than men do and become more mature. But if young people marry when they're 15, 16 years old, then oftentimes they're just not prepared for it, physically and mentally. Now, teenage marriages have little chance of success. I don't think there's any question about that. Sociologists, all the statistics tell us that if young people marry too young, then that marriage probably is not going to last. Now, there have been some exceptions to it, and we appreciate that, but generally it is not true. When young people marry as teenagers, their marriages generally will not stand. Some figures years ago indicated that 58% of marriages among teenagers will end in divorce. But it's gotten worse, even worse today than it was then. So there needs to be physical preparation and then moral preparation. It is good when young people have moral values and they want to do what the Bible teaches and gives them the authority to do. I heard someone tell about a young man who wanted to do what was right. He wanted scriptural authority for everything he did, and he was wondering if it would be all right for him to kiss his fiancée. And he read that passage in Romans 16:16, which says, "Salute one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you." And he wondered if that gave him the authority to kiss his fiancée. And he went to the preacher and talked to him about it. And the preacher said, well, that was a cultural matter. It really wasn't talking about marriage. Back at that time, instead of shaking hands as we do today in greeting people, they use a kiss to greet people. He was not fully convinced on everything, but he thought he'd better be careful. And the next time he took his girlfriend home, walked her to the door, stuck out his hand to shake hands with her, to say goodnight to her. Then he walked off the porch and started toward his car, and his wife called him. His girlfriend called him and said, "Wait a minute." She jumped off that porch and grabbed a hold of him and laid a kiss on him that wouldn't quit. She laid a lip lock on him, and when she came up for that breath, he said, "We can't do that. Where's the scripture for it?" She said, Matthew 7:12, "Therefore all things whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do ye even so to them." Well, it's good to have some desire to do that which is right, and have scripture for everything we do. We do need to be careful in this field and not become involved in anything that would be immoral. That won't help a marriage. Sometimes young people think they ought to go ahead and become involved in the physical side of marriage, and that'll enable them to know if they're compatible and if they're going to have a good marriage. Well, the truth is that can usually destroy the possibility of even having a good marriage, because they'll lose respect for each other. They'll never be able to say, "I know he won't do this or that, and she won't do this or that," but they never can be sure of it because they've done that. I remember a couple. They became involved in immorality before marriage. They thought it'd be all right for them to become involved in the physical side of marriage, and so they became involved in it. And they became unwed parents. But when they decided or knew they were going to be parents, they went ahead and got married. And the baby was born and then died. And those two folks have suffered ever since, thinking that they were being punished because they had committed sin. I worked with that lady. She was a primary one that really had trouble with it. I tried to encourage her. She had repented. She was truly sorry for the thing. She was. And she continued to suffer as a result of it. And I would try to tell her, you need to believe in God's promises. You've repented. You were really sorry for it. You've changed. And you need to accept God's forgiveness for it and not continue to carry that burden of guilt. But that's a lot easier to say than it is to do it. And she has continued to suffer through many years because of that immorality. So young people need to remember to keep themselves pure during the courtship period, because if you become involved in immorality, it may cause you to suffer the rest of your life. Even though you marry that person, it may cause you to suffer. Years ago, a Purdue University sociologist estimated that 1 out of 6 brides is pregnant before wedding. 1 out of 6. It is much worse than that now. I think the latest figures indicate that 1 out of every 2 brides today is expecting a child when they marry. Now that's a tragic thing, isn't it? But out in the world, people are not concerned about what the Bible says, as you and I are. You think of all those people in the world who don't know what the Bible teaches, don't care what it teaches, and they think that it is just as right to involve themselves in that type of thing as eating and drinking. I have an article written by Brother Willard Collins, great preacher, former president of Lipscomb. He was talking about this very thing. He says, God places these desires within us, hunger, thirst, and it's right and good when you follow God's will in regard to eating and drinking. We ought not to drink something we ought not to eat some things that we ought not to eat. Also is true in regard to the sexual desire as well. God placed it in people, and as long as we follow God's will in that regard, it's a beautiful arrangement in marriage. It is not ugly at all. It's not unclean at all. It is what God has instituted. And back in Genesis chapter 2, he said, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. And then, therefore, shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. God placed it in marriage, and in marriage, it is a beautiful arrangement. Outside of marriage, it is an ugly thing. The Bible teaches us that these works of the flesh are sinful and wrong. Galatians 5:19 through 21. The first 3 sins mentioned there are sexual sins. And they are very ugly things and can ruin a person's life and the possibility of a good marriage. So the Bible teaches us that we're to be moral and pure. Now, sometimes people have the wrong idea. I heard Brother Don Myers, whom some of you may know. You probably heard him say the same thing here when he was preaching here. He was preaching over at Eastern Meadows and talking to young people. And he said sometimes a girl or a lady will say, I kept myself pure until I married. Now that's really a thing that can lead you to believe the wrong thing. When she got married and she fulfilled that part of marriage, she was not being impure. So a lady ought not to say, I kept myself pure until I married. When you're married and obeying the will of God in that regard, you're not being impure. But we do need to keep ourselves pure, free from immorality, because it can ruin the possibility of a good marriage. A marriage that is based upon immorality is not going to be very successful. Now, I and these other preachers have dealt with situations through the years that will tell you you don't need to become involved in immorality before marriage. It will not contribute to a good marriage. In fact, it probably will destroy the possibility of having a good marriage. There needs to be moral preparation. Keep yourselves pure, Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:22. Number 3, there must be intellectual preparation. Sometimes young people grow up without having the mama to teach them things they really ought to know, basic things. A mother said to her teenage daughter, your hair looks like a mop. She said, what is a mop? Now that may be a strange thing, but sometimes young people grow up without even knowing some of the basic things they ought to know. Studies of various kinds have indicated that the higher education one has, the better possibility that one has for marriage. Teenage divorce is 6 times greater than divorces among those who are older. 6 times more. I mentioned a while ago that one figure indicated years ago that 58% of teenage marriages fail, and today is worse than it was then. Young people who may be tempted to interrupt their education in high school to quit and get married probably ruin the possibility of ever having many material things in life. Because if they quit school in high school, they probably won't get any more education, won't be able to get a good job, they won't make as much money as they would if they had waited. And so it's a good thing for young people to think about it, think about the future, and know some things when they're young. They need to wait until they are older in order to get married and have an education that will enable them to have more of the things they want to have. A marriage in which the 2 people are very different educationally can also be a problem. I remember a couple in the congregation where I was preaching. They married young, and his wife gave up the possibility of going to school in order to work and send him to school. So he graduated from college and got a good job, but he was way up here intellectually, educationally, and she was way down here, and that caused some problems. Later, he left her for some young, educated woman. Now that woman and that man probably were not as happy as they would have been otherwise. People need to realize they need to use common sense. And education sometimes is involved in common sense. That will enable them to have more common sense. So we need to be prepared as far as we can educationally. And then there is economic preparation. It takes money to get married and stay married. Some are anxious to get married. In fact, sometimes they're too anxious to get married. There was a young man who asked a girl to marry him, and she said, I really couldn't marry you right now until you save about $10,000. We need $10,000 to get started. So he started working on trying to save money. About a year later, he asked her again, are we ready to get married now? And she said, how much have you saved? He said, about $45. She said, well, that's close enough. Too many times we're ready to jump into marriage when we're really not ready financially to get married. Now, sometimes young people talk to their parents and say, 2 can live together as cheaply as 1. You better not believe that. If one of them is dead, maybe so. But if both of them are alive and both of them have to eat and have clothes and insurance and cars and this and that, 2 cannot live together as cheaply as 1. And young people need to realize that and be prepared financially when they get married. Some marriages fail because they don't have enough money to do everything they want to do, or they haven't been able to adjust to a less amount of money, and so they have really never been happy. When one couple married, the man asked his wife, "Now, do you want to be the president or the vice president?" She said, "I don't want to be either one of them. I'd just like to be the treasurer." We need to make preparation when we get married and realize the importance of that part of marriage. You know, there are 3 books that are vital if you're going to have a good marriage. One is the book, the Bible, and the second is a cookbook. That's going to be important as well. I heard about a man who had married and was talking to his wife about her cooking. He said, "You don't cook biscuits like my mother." And she said, "You don't make dough like my father either." A cookbook is important, as well as the book, and then a pocketbook. All of that is important if you're going to have a good marriage. It is significant that when God made Adam and Eve, He prepared them with the economic and physical needs. He gave them clothing to wear with animals and then leaves. God provided for what they needed then. You know, today when young people get married, they want to have a house like mom and daddy have. They like to have furniture and everything like mom and daddy have. But it's not reasonable to think that they can get married and have just as much as mom and daddy have now. They've been married for 20 years. They've been working on it, growing and saving. And so young people need to realize that when they get married, it isn't reasonable to think that they're going to live as well as mom and daddy are living. People should not expect that. Well, somebody read this in the want ads one time. Personal. Bachelor with 40 acres of excellent land. Would like to make acquaintance of lady with tractor. Matrimony in mind. Please send picture of tractor. It's good to think about the material side, you know, and the money you're going to need, and he must have been thinking about that. Economic preparation is important. When I went to Harding, I'd been here 2 years, graduated from Alabama Christian College. And Paul Torrance and I and my wife all graduated together here. We went to Harding, and Mackie and I had married. She'd already begged me to marry her, so we got married. And she had a job prepared when she got there. She was going to work in one of the offices. I was going to work on the campus, and we were going to make it through school all right. And Paul and I began to preach at 2 congregations. He'd go to one, I'd go to the other. Next week, we'd swap and use the same sermons at those that way, you see. We didn't just fall off a turnip truck, you see. And Paul, of course, was a good friend of ours, and we knew each other. He had to leave his girlfriend back here when he went to Harding. He and Elaine were in love, but she was still in high school, and they didn't get married. But Paul saw Mackie and me, visited with us in our home, knew all about us. He came home to visit with his parents, and he said, "Daddy, Charlie and Mackie are married out there at Harding, and they're saving money." He was trying to tell him they ought to be able to get married as well. I don't know where he got that saving money part of the thing, though. But Paul then quit school after that first year there, but he got married, and then later he married again, got more education. But he was concerned about getting married, and he thought he ought to be able to get married and live as we were living. He probably could have lived better, but he was concerned about the financial part, and everybody needs to be concerned about that if they're going to get married. There needs to be some economic. There should be emotional preparation. One of the chief causes of failure in marriage today is emotional immaturity on the part of one or both of the marriage partners. They're not grown up yet. A man and wife were having trouble in their marriage. They went to a marriage counselor, and the counselor was asking the husband, first of all, "What do you see as the problem in your marriage?" He said, "My wife is one of the most immature people I've ever seen." And the counselor said, "Well, be a little more specific. What do you mean she's immature?" He said, "Take last night, for example. She came in when I was in the bathtub and sunk every one of my little boots in the bathtub. You know. Sometimes we're the ones who are immature. And if we are immature, it's going to be difficult to deal with marriage. Little things can grow into big things if we're not mature enough to deal with those things. So the Bible teaches us to be grown inwardly and outwardly. Brotherly love leads us to grow and mature emotionally and be able to handle all these problems. You should be able to carry a certain amount of tension without blowing up and having a big problem made of it. If we are emotionally mature, we'll be able to handle most of those little things before they become big things. You should be emotionally independent of your parents. Don't move in with parents when you get married. Brother E.R. Brannon was a good friend of ours since Mackie and I came to school at Alabama Christian. He was the dean and became a good friend of ours and was through the years. And I remember hearing him preach on a number of occasions, and I heard him talking about this particular thing. He was saying, when you get married, don't move in and live with your parents. Move 500 miles away from home, cross 3 rivers, 2 of which don't have bridges over them, and get so far away it'd take $10 to call home. Now, he was making a point there. It's important to be emotionally able to deal with your own marriage and not be dependent upon parents. You know, birds have more sense than we do. You've seen bird nests. Have you ever seen a bird nest with a little room built off to the side for Junior and his bride? You never see that. They teach those birds to fly and how to get their food and then kick them out, and they go and make their own nest, you see. Birds have more sense than we do. They don't move in with mom and daddy. They make their own nest. Common sense tells us we ought to do that as well. Emotional preparation is vital, very important. And then we need to be prepared with the right attitudes. It's extremely important that each young person come to marriage with a deep, genuine, unselfish concern for the marriage partner. We need to be able to live together, work together, do everything we can to help each other, and that means we need to have an attitude of love. Sometimes we're going to have differences. There are going to be some problems along the way, but if we love one another, we can solve every problem. In addition to the physical attraction, romantic love, there's a deeper kind of love that we will need, and that is this agape love, and we need to love one another and put the other person before ourselves. In 1 Corinthians 13, verse 5, when Paul described the behavior of love, he said, seeketh not her own. Love doesn't seek her own good. Love seeks the good of the other person. And so when a man and woman marry, if they have that kind of love, they'll put the other person first. I believe that virtually every problem in marriages can be solved if they love one another. I've done quite a bit of marriage counseling, and I have observed, I believe, that the answer to most of our problems is the fact that we're concerned about self. I have talked to people having marriage problems, and what word would you think I would hear most often as I talk with them about their marriage problems? What word would you say I would hear most? Me. M-E. Let me tell you what she did to me. Let me tell you what she said to me. And then she says the same thing, you know. Me. They're thinking of self. But most problems could be solved if they loved the other person as they love themselves. The bride has the responsibility to make her husband as happy as she can. He has the same responsibility. The Bible tells us in Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. If a husband loves his wife as Christ loved the church, they can solve any problem. They can get along well. And then in Titus 2 and verse 4, Paul teaches a woman has the same responsibility, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children. Husbands and wives need to be grounded in love for each other. They need to prepare by loving one another. Attitudes are going to be very important in marriage. I remember counseling with a couple that had split up after a number of years. She didn't want to be married anymore. She didn't want to be involved in marriage at all anymore. They had 4 children by that time. 2 of them were grown. 1 was in the service already. And then the second boy was married, and they had 2 younger children. And when I was talking with her, I was trying to encourage her to love him as she did in the beginning. She said, I didn't love him in the beginning. Now, that was a shock. And I said, why did you marry him then? She said she was being abused by a stepfather, and she married this young man to get away from that situation. Now, that's a tragic thing. There ought to be another way to deal with it instead of marrying somebody and then divorcing him later because you didn't love him. Young people need to love each other. Don't get married unless you really love each other. Attitudes are going to be very important. And that attitude of love can solve every problem. And then again, number 7, there needs to be spiritual preparation. Obviously, young people need to be Christians, and they need to make preparation from a spiritual standpoint. They need to be growing in Christ, growing more and more into the kind of person God wants them to be, and the kind of husband and wife that God wants them to be. Marriage is not just a social union. It's not just a legal contract, but it is a spiritual relationship. It is primarily a spiritual relationship. In Ephesians 5:23, Paul said, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Now, this decision of the person you're going to marry is the second most important decision you will ever make. The first one, of course, is to become a Christian. Give yourself to Christ. That's most important. But the second most important decision is the person you're going to marry. That decision will obviously directly affect that first decision. Where you spend eternity will in large measure be determined by the person you marry. So you need to make a good choice along that line, and you need to date long enough to really know that person. If you do not know that person real well, after you get married, you're going to discover some things, you see. Love is blind, but marriage is an eye-opener. And you need to make some preparation for marriage so those things will not destroy your marriage. Some years ago, Dr. Carl Brackeen and Paul Faulkner, both teachers at Abilene, used to go and conduct marriage seminars here and there as a team. And it was a great program. They did a real good job. But their services became so demanding, they finally decided to put it on film. And they did, and many congregations were able to have those seminars by watching the film. I was preaching for the Beltline Church in Decatur, Alabama then, and we had a building there that seat 1,100 people. And we decided to have that marriage seminar on film and invite people of the area to come to be with us. And on Wednesday night, we were having about 600 people in that auditorium. Now, when you put 600 in a building like that, it looked pretty well full. But that's a lot of people to come together on Wednesday nights to see that series, marriage series. And there was one thing that Carl Brackeen said that impressed me and sticks with me to this day. He was saying, before you marry someone, date him for a year, through summer and winter and spring and fall. Date that person for a year. He said, now the weather doesn't have much to do with it, but if you date someone for a year, for a whole year, you're probably going to come to know that person. That person will really show up what he really is or what she really is. And you really need to do that. Really know that person. If you really know some people, you would not want to marry them. And the time to find it out is before you get married. So go with that person, date that person long enough to learn some things about that person. So we need to be prepared in all of these areas that we've talked about. You may think of some other areas, but these 7 are vitally important, I believe. Now, on the back of that sheet you picked up, there were some other things. Don't have time to deal with them now. It's time for us to quit. So bring that with you the next time, and let me talk about those a little bit before we get into the next lesson. We're going to be talking about real marriage from then on. Next time, we want to talk about what it means to be a wife. Now, ladies, don't stay home next week because of that. Come back and be with us. We'll talk about that the next time. Good to have you today.